Fernandez, Minister of Tourism, Honorable Jamal Pringle, Leader of the Opposition, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Professor Justin C. Robinson, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Campus Principal, Professor Bharat Anand, our invited guest, staff and faculty of the UWI Five Islands campus, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I've been tasked to offer some welcome remarks, and I will be brief, as brevity, I'm told, is the soul of wit. The University of the West Indies Five Islands campus, in collaboration with a number of statutory bodies and private sector partners, is thrilled to bring its second public lecture to the Antigua and Barbuda public, the wider UWI community, and the diaspora. The annual public lecture aims to provide a platform through thought leadership for insightful, stimulating, and thought-provoking discussions, intellectual discourse, and the exchange of ideas to nurture change on local, regional, and global scales. Professor Bharat Anand, the Henry R. Byers Professor of Business Administration and Vice Provost for Advances in Learning at Harvard University, is our distinguished lecturer tonight. He's an expert in digital strategy, digital marketing, and corporate strategy, and indeed, this second public lecture, entitled Digital Transformation from Commerce to Learning, promises to be enlightening, enriching, and is expected to be a scholarly treat that will appeal to academics, policymakers, private sector partners, and indeed the wider community. Let me welcome you all to this, our second public lecture at the Five Islands campus, and invite our new principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Justin Robinson, to offer a few remarks. Professor Robinson.
Good evening. Honorable Charles Fernand, Minister of Tourism, year 1923, and they came out of it in 2023, and they went into the worst supermarket in Antigua. They would probably be completely shocked by the variety of goods and services in one place, the amount of cars, etc., etc. It is clear that we are now on the cusp, if not in the midst, of such another dramatic change in human circumstances. I'm here using my cell phone, and I'm always amazed by how we take the cell phone for granted. I have a lot of research collaborators in India, and we think nothing of doing a WhatsApp call with each other from Antigua, Barbados to India, and it's just a routine thing. Some of us in here are old enough to know when you had to go through an operator, make the call, wait, and now we take this for granted. So I'm really excited about this digital transformation and where it could take us, because it's clear that we are in a similar transformative phase. And the way I think about it, being an optimist, the way in which the Industrial Revolution released us from the limits of our own muscle and animal power, this digital age has the potential to release us from the limits of our own mental capacities, you know. So as smart as Hiram Ford thinks he is, he can only solve so many equations in his head, and he can only solve them so quickly. And as he gets older, that capacity declines. But with machines, AI now, I see a great potential for us to be freed from the limits of our own mental capacity. So I quite look forward to the lecture. I'm really excited to be here, thrilled to be here in Antigua in this role. And I want to take the opportunity to commend the government of the Antigua for the boldness in setting up this new UWI campus. Because what it gives us the opportunity to do, you know, we have 4 other UWI campuses. One going back 75 years. What we get a chance to do is, if you are starting a university today, in the digital age, how would you set it up? How would you configure it? I mean, what suits this age? The old model might work, it might not, but we have a chance to really envisage a system of teaching, learning, research that fits this digital age, that is really not bound by the 75 years of tradition. So I look forward to the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Robinson. At this juncture, I would like to invite the head of the School of Business and Management, Dr. Karen Murdoch, to introduce our feature speaker tonight.
Mr. Chairman, allow me to adopt the established protocol. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Our speaker tonight is Professor Bharat Anand, who is the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning at Harvard University, and the Henry R. Byers Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, has received acclaim for its perspective on strategy and digital transformation. It was named as one of Fast Company's top 10 business books of 2016 and Bloomberg's best books of 2017, and by Walmart CEO Doug McMillon as his favorite book of the year. In 2014, Professor Anand helped create and launch the digital learning platforms for Harvard Business School online and was its first senior associate dean. HBSO's virtual classroom has been described by Fortune as the classroom of the future. In his current role as vice provost, he has led Harvard University's effort to formulate, communicate, and implement strategic priorities around online learning and residential teaching across the university. Professor Anand was part of Harvard's central leadership team to support and oversee the university's transition to remote teaching during the pandemic, and most recently chaired a university-wide task force that crafted a strategic roadmap for teaching and learning for the university. He's currently chairing the Harvard Generative AI for Teaching and Learning Task Force. Professor Anand is a renowned teacher and a two-time winner of the Best Teacher Award at Harvard Business School. He's a two-time recipient of the Greenhill Award for Outstanding Contribution to Harvard Business School. He received his BA in Economics from Harvard College, magna cum laude, and his PhD in Economics from Princeton University. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium Professor Bharat Anand.
Thank you. All right. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. His Excellency Sir Rodney Williams, Governor General of Antigua and Barbuda, the Honorable Charles Fernandez, Minister of Tourism, the Honorable Jamal Pringle, Leader of the Opposition, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Professor Justin Robinson, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Campus Principal, staff and faculty of the UWI Five Islands campus, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is an honor and a privilege to deliver the second public lecture here. Thank you for giving me that honor. I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts and learnings about digital transformation, as Professor Robinson was describing it. And this is a topic or a set of topics I've been engaged in for the last 30 years. Actually 40, and I'll come back to that in a second. What I thought we might do is I'll break up this talk into 3 parts. The overriding theme is what are the key lessons we have learned from digital transformation, which by the way now has been impacting us for 30 years. In different sectors, we think about this as just a recent impact, but the impact really started in what we might call the content industries. Okay. Newspapers, music, books, TV, those were the first industries in the economy to be hit. What I'd like to do is use examples from those industries to offer some thoughts about what are the more general implications for how we think about digital transformation, digital change, digital strategy in other businesses, retail, advertising, banking, and finally education, where I have been personally involved for the last 11 years in Harvard's efforts. One thing I will say is every single lesson we have learned, every single idea that we came up with at the university was informed directly by examples of what was happening elsewhere. And I say that because it's very tempting, depending on which business or organization or sector you are, to think that our challenges are so unique. Even the language we use is unique. But when we think about these kinds of technologies, the implications are in fact quite general. And so that's a theme I want to keep coming back to. how did my interest in the content industry start? As I said, it sort of started 40 years ago. And I think its roots can be traced to Antigua. The picture of Sir Viv Richards was mesmerizing and terrifying to any kid in India watching these matches on live television for the first time. Those are, in fact, some of the events which really became the defining moments when we would watch television. A lot of these stories were covered in the newspapers. I apologize for that particular headline. It just happens to be a coincidental story I picked up from 1983. Around the time I was just about finishing high school, entering college, I left India when I was 16, went to the school in Italy, and that's a long story. And there got introduced to music beyond Bollywood, to reggae, Jimmy Page, my favorite musician in the world, and so on. This is where my passion was. And so once I finished my PhD and I start really looking at research projects, this is when the internet was hitting. It just so happened that these were the industries being hit first. I said, wow, this is a great opportunity to combine work and play. It turns out these universities were the canaries in the digital coal mine. Pretty much everything we've seen elsewhere has arisen from what was happening there. And that's the story I want to actually walk you through. And I have to say it was a personal delight passing this yesterday. My only regret is that he's not here today. All right. Generative AI. Let me start there, but then sort of weave the story backwards. These are some headlines from what we have heard recently. ChatGPT could disrupt 19% of US jobs, is yours on the list. And at the same time, we see headlines like this: reasons why ChatGPT is not a disruptive technology. We see a whole bunch of headlines about how it might impact particular industries. This is just about marketing. These predictions are all over the place, all over the place. In fact, it reminds me of the predictions we had when the internet first came along, which was 1994. What was supposed to happen with the internet? If you just look at the content industries or television in particular, there was the promise of hyper-targeting of video content. To those who wanted particular pieces of content, we could deliver that to them. Near perfect matching is what we thought would result. The end of television advertising because you could skip TV ads, and that, I'll come back to that. And much better measurement because of big data. It turns out most of those predictions were wrong. And I say that only because of the general principle: whenever you hear anyone talking about here's what's going to happen next, beware. In fact, the more definitive the prediction, the more you should beware. What I want to do is instead start with two stories. Okay? Two stories outside education, and then come back to thinking about the implications of this for education. Does anyone know what this is? This is, it's a warehouse in a newspaper printing facility. That's newsprint. That's just paper. Okay, reams and reams of paper. This particular photo was from a plant in South Africa, in Johannesburg. I went up to the plant manager and I said, what is this room going to look like 10 years from now? I thought I would get a rousing defense of print. Instead, he walks up to me and whispers in my ear. He said, Bharat, I get all my news on the iPad. I'm like, oh, come on. Like, of all people, I thought you were going to defend print. If we think about, this was the first industry, the very first industry hit by the internet. If you ask the question, what are the reasons why the internet was so threatening for newspapers? Here's the list of reasons. There's real-time updating of news with digital technology. It's much easier to search. Much greater variety. In fact, as you were talking about the supermarkets, an order of magnitude greater variety when we see digital news. Rich media, it's video, audio, not just text. Access anytime, anywhere. It's interactive, and prices are much lower. Okay? If you thought about a digital product that was superior to the physical product, this is it. If you look at the data on how circulation per household has changed over time, this is for all US newspapers over time. This is what it looks like. Actually, I just realized I left out the time axis, which is not a good thing. If you were to guess what is the exact year and month that this decline starts, by the way, what would you say? Sorry? 1996, 95, around then, because of the internet. So it turns out I didn't leave out the time axis. This is what the data looks like. Oh my gosh, this starts in 1940. It starts with radio, then black and white TV, then color TV, then cable TV, then cable news, then 24/7 cable news. Finally, the internet hits in 1994-95. By the way, the impact of the internet is empirically indistinguishable from 60 years of technology that came before it. Isn't that interesting? Every story we hear about digital change in this business is that the internet destroyed newspapers. By the way, we're still hearing those stories today, written by journalists. That story is fundamentally wrong. Now, there's one aspect in which the internet did impact newspapers, but it has nothing to do with news. The piece of the newspaper business that was impacted by the internet was the classifieds business. The classifieds are the real estate listings, jobs postings, cars for sale. Those classifieds accounted for 50% of the revenue for most newspapers and more than half the profits. It had nothing to do with news. This data shows what happened to circulation revenue versus classifieds revenue for US newspapers. Circulation revenue is the dark red line. By the way, that decline in circulation per household was offset 1-for-1 by price increases, meaning over the last 30 years, circulation revenues roughly flat. Isn't that amazing? The dark blue line is retail advertising, those big ads you see in the newspapers. That's fallen by about 30%. Classifieds revenue, I don't know if you can see this back there, is the light blue line. That drops by 90% with the internet. 90%. That basically disappeared. Okay. Why is this interesting? Well, it actually throws out a different puzzle, which is online classifieds were better than print classifieds because there was real-time updating, it was easier to search, greater variety, rich media, more or less free, and so on. The same attributes that we talked about digital news affect digital classifieds. And yet the puzzle is, why is it then, despite the same digital attributes, news only declines slowly away from print, whereas classifieds falls off a cliff? I think there's lessons here for digital change much more broadly. In fact, I would argue this is a metaphor for pretty much everything that's happening in the broader economy. So let me spend a couple minutes on this. And then if you ignore the rest of the talk, it's okay. Okay? Okay, news. What is news? We produce news in a newsroom, in a newspaper. Let's call it the hub of the organization. We distribute it to readers who are, let's call them, in the spokes of the organization. So it's hub to spoke. When digital comes along, the big benefit we all thought was that we can now take that same production process and reach many more spokes. It was all about low-cost distribution, high reach, and scale. In fact, I would argue 90% of organizations and managers still think in that way about the internet. And that misses the most interesting part of the internet. We had scale and low-cost distribution with TV and radio. The thing we didn't have was two other features of the internet. The first, digital technologies are not just about allowing you to broadcast and reach more people. It's not just about hub to spoke. It's about spoke to hub interactions. Consumers can talk back to us. They can interact with the product. They can tell us what they like, what they don't like. We can personalize the product and service based on their preferences. So that's the second piece of the internet. Not hub to spoke, but spoke to hub. But the third piece is even more interesting, that digital technologies allow not just hub to spoke interactions and spoke to hub, but spoke to spoke. They allow anyone to connect with anyone else. That was what the classifieds model was. Classifieds were basically just a way for the newspaper to connect buyers and sellers. Now, why is that interesting? When you have those kinds of connected dynamics, we often call them network effects in the jargon. The big effect of this is the following. If I'm competing in a market with network effects, here's what happens. Let's say you and I have the same product that we've produced. For some reason, you have 50% market share, I have 30%. The value of the product increases to you as there are more customers using that product. That's the point of the network effect. So what happens is more customers come into the market, you'll get slightly bigger share of those customers. You go to 55%, I go to 33%. Now the difference has become greater. As more customers come in, you go to 62%, I go to 35%, and this is what starts happening, which is in network markets, you don't see competition neck and neck between 37% and 39% market share. You usually see winner take all or winner take most. So in those markets, one company usually ends up dominating. That's why they're interesting. By the way, when organizations based on product features, competing on product features or content, compete with organizations whose anchor is connections, the latter usually wins. That's not a matter of preferences or beliefs, it's just the economics, like I described. Okay? So why is that interesting? Because most organizations, even in education, most universities, we think of ourselves as content organizations. We think, oh my gosh, when digital comes along, we can share this content with more people. That's not the most interesting part of digital. So this is the first lesson I would love for you to think about, which is the big benefit of the internet was not greater reach and scale, it was greater interactivity and connectedness. It seems so obvious when I say that, but when you think about companies that really take advantage of those features in designing products and services, it's a much smaller number. I just wanted to give you a preview of what this simple metaphor means for how we think about education. We think of ourselves as hub-to-spoke organizations. The faculty are in the hub, the students in the spokes. The lecture classroom was essentially the faculty speaking and the students listening. They barely spoke. In many of our classes on our campus, they still barely speak. When we go to digital, there's a big temptation to reproduce that model and reach more people, as opposed to taking advantage of the fact that, oh, it's now much easier to get students to talk back to us using digital technologies, and I'll give you many examples of that, or even easier to get students to connect with each other using these technologies. That's the piece that really is the big opportunity for us. Okay, so I just wanted to connect the dots before coming back to this later on. By the way, I've just summarized the 330-page book in about 10 minutes. Okay. All right, so moving on. You may not be able to read this, so I'll just read it for you. I'll keep throwing out these reflections as we move along. The real power of digital is not greater reach, but interactivity and connectedness. By the way, the best digital marketing strategy is to spend no money on marketing. If I create a product that has strong network, I win. Think about how much money Meta or Microsoft spend on marketing. Like almost nothing. The best quality product need not win in digital markets. Remember, I said if you have 95% market share and I have 5%, let's say I come up with a better product, nothing happens. I've got to move the entire network from you to me. That's a coordination problem. These are all counterintuitive implications which we're still beginning to get our handle around. Okay? By the way, even the tech giants get this wrong. Apple, when it introduced the Mac in 1984, Steve Jobs called it not a great product, he called it insanely great. By the way, every time they introduced a new product, they'd call it insanely great. It turns out insanely great ended up with 3% market share. I don't think there's any person on the planet who would say Microsoft and IBM was a better product. Like, I don't wake up every day thanking Bill Gates and everyone who came after him. Apple was a better designed product, easy to use, plug and play, but it got 3%. Why? Because Microsoft was playing a different game. They were trying to build the network. They were open. The advantages of open were basically the Apple product was competing on design and look and feel, but that's not the reason we bought hardware. We bought it because of the apps, and we bought it to communicate with each other. And so if you had a product with many more customers, that's where the app developers would build. As you had more app developers building, that would attract more customers. That was one feedback loop or network. And the second is you had more customers, I could connect to many more people, and so on and so on and so forth. Here's what's interesting about this story. We have just seen the greatest transformation in corporate history over the last 20 years with Apple, since the introduction of the iPod. It went from near bankruptcy to about $2 trillion in market value. Its share in personal computers during this period has gone from 3% to about 9%. That's it. Let's put it another way. Think of a company, in this case Microsoft, my friends there allow me to say this, that's basically made every wrong decision in technology for 20 years. It still has 91% market share. That's the power of the network. Networks allow you to make strategic mistakes. This is a tweet from an Airbnb executive. I often tell my students, please don't tweet like this. It's rude. But it conveys a very interesting point. It says, Marriott wants to add 30,000 rooms this year. We will add that in the next 2 weeks. Marriott is in the business of selling rooms to those who need it. Airbnb is in the business of connecting people who have rooms with those who want rooms. We're all familiar with Uber. What might be less familiar is how it started. It started with a company basically having its own drivers, Uber Black, and it grows nicely. At some point, it couldn't keep up with demand, and so it opens up to any third-party driver who wanted to be a partner, and that's when this takes off. Another way to say this is if you want growth, you should innovate. If you want exponential growth, you should connect. Does that make sense? All right. People often ask me, which is the exemplar of connected strategies? I say it's not West, but East. It's in China. Tencent. Some of you may have heard about WeChat. Together with WhatsApp, one of the fastest growing apps in history. WeChat, what's interesting is it's not just a messaging app. You can read books on it. You can watch movies. You can listen to music. Here's what happened over time. They start out with instant messaging. Instant messaging has strong network effects. They win the market, 95% market share, but it was a free product. So how do you monetize a free product? Well, they did something interesting. This is before email was really ubiquitous in China. Everyone was on the instant messaging app. Their online identity was the 8-digit number that WeChat gave to them. Okay, that's fine, 8-digit numbers, but in a billion-person market, like, that's a lot of numbers. I want to stand out from the crowd as an individual with an 8-digit number, so they give you the option of buying your own favorite 8-digit number, like a personalized license plate for 99 cents. Only 3% of the market takes advantage of that. But in a billion-person market, like, that's big enough. They then go on, and this is before broadband, so we couldn't upload pictures of ourselves. So they said, look, your online identity, if you want a visual, pick any one of 500 emojis. That's your online identity. Okay, so you're happy, that's great, except those 500 emojis are shared across 1 billion people. So again, they figure out a way to monetize this. They say you can buy a virtual Gucci shirt to put on your emoji, so you stand out from the crowd. By the way, that's only 99 cents. Again, only 3% of the market takes advantage of it. That's a huge amount of money in that market. This is how they start monetizing. By the way, this was 10 years before NFTs and the metaverse. This was NFTs in the 2D world. They got even smarter after a while. Instead of selling you that virtual Gucci shirt, they started renting it to you every month. So they converted basically what was a transaction into an annuity. They go from there to multiplayer games, social networks, and finally WeChat. And as I said, WeChat you're using for everything now. One of the most interesting applications was when they thought about the virtual red envelope. For anyone who's visited China, people give gifts to each other during the major holidays, Chinese New Year, and so on, in a red envelope. They give you cash. So they said, you can send a virtual envelope through WeChat to someone. I send it to Justin. He opens the virtual red envelope, and there's cash that's transferred from me to him. You can see the network effects. Their share in mobile e-commerce went from 19% to 30% within 3 months. This is how they think. All right, coming back to news, you might be wondering, is there any newspaper that recognized this classifieds problem? And the answer is yes. There were a few. There's one in particular in Norway that really got my attention. It's a company called Schibsted. They saw this problem early on. They jump into classifieds online, and they win classifieds in Norway. Their market share in real estate today is 95% online. In jobs is 95%. And get this, they say in their annual report, our market share in selling online, cars online is 115%. So when I read this, I went to them and I said, I know you guys are smart. You're not that smart. Market shares have to add up to 100%. They said, no, it's 115%. Why do you think they were saying that? Because the site was so liquid that people in Germany, Denmark, and Finland were selling cars through the Norwegian site, which means they were selling more cars than there were cars in Norway. And they were charging $50 a listing. This is a money machine. They win in Norway, they then move to Sweden, then Finland, then France. Today they're globally #1 in classifieds. That accounts for 85% of their market share. By the way, it raises an interesting question, and I'm going to come back to this. If you're a newspaper company, what business are you really in? Is it news or classifieds? I'll tell you what, just keep that on the side. I'm going to come back to that, okay? All right, here's what they do in news. I don't know if you remember this major volcanic ash crisis over Iceland. It's an unpronounceable name about 11 years ago. The ash spread all over Europe. They start putting out stories. What are the stories they put out? Oh, the weather patterns. When is this thing going to move over? The health implications. Is it safe to inhale the ash? And so on and so forth. It turns out no one was reading these stories. Why? During that volcanic ash crisis, what was the #1 thing most people in Norway were concerned about? Sorry? Safety. Actually, something even more immediate. Sorry? It was travel. So all airlines were canceled. So people were stuck in different cities in Norway, and they're asking, how do I get from point A to point B? Schibsted management notices messages that start popping up on the Schibsted websites, where people are asking, hey, I need to go from Oslo to Trondheim. Is anyone driving? Someone replies, yep, I'm driving. I can meet 3 people at the train station. Meet me at 3 o'clock. They see this happening. They go to their IT team, and they build an app called Hitchhiker Central within 7 hours, whose only function was to allow people to share information on rides with each other. That's what it was. This became the most popular app, not just in Norway, in all of Europe. And notice one thing. This is about connectedness. This is the question they asked themselves during this crisis, which they now ask themselves during every crisis. How can we help readers help each other? So if there's one thing I'd love for you to take away from this first part of the story, it's create to connect, regardless of which business you're in, okay? Everyone good so far? All right, my second story is about music. This makes newspapers look like a growing industry. This was the decline in CD sales starting in 2000. What caused this decline? What was the triggering event? Napster. File sharing comes along, piracy, and basically that was the end of CDs. Oh, that's the story we were told. The question is, could something else have been causing this decline in CDs? And there's one obvious answer, is digital MP3 formats came along, and so all we did was replace CDs with songs in the new format. It was just a format change story. By the way, if the format change story were true, there's a way to test this, because there have been previous periods of format change within the industry, from vinyl to cassette, from cassette to CD. So we went out and collected the data on those previous episodes just to see how it compared to this episode, and here's what it looks like. It's literally identical in the speed of decline. Like, we had to go back and double and triple check this data. So here's why this is interesting. If you think piracy is what kills your business, the only strategic implication is to get the best lawyers in the room and find out the IP addresses of those who are pirating. On the other hand, if you think this is a format change story, the right strategic question to ask is, how can we make money in the new format? And the answer is, oh, maybe through selling digital songs, maybe through hardware, selling things like the iPod, maybe through Spotify and subscriptions, merchandising, and oh, by the way, concerts, live events. It turns out the price of concerts used to track the rate of inflation almost 1-to-1 for ages. Starting in the mid to late 90s, just as piracy increases, concert prices explode. Why is that? Because 30 years ago, concerts were priced cheaply. They were the advertisement for you to go and buy the CD. Now that we can't control the price of music, that relationship has flipped. Free music is the advertisement to go to the live concert, which, by the way, the artists love. Taylor Swift is taking home $10 million a night. It's just that she has to work slightly harder. Here's the tragedy in this story. Universal Music, which was the largest record label, sells its concerts business in 1999. Why did they do this? Because we were telling them to do this. All the management consultants were saying, if you have a problem with your business, focus, focus, focus on what you do best, your core competence. And they said, oh, making CDs is our core competence. That's exactly the wrong way to think in these digital markets. If the market is growing, then that's fine to focus. If the market is declining, you don't want to think more narrowly, you want to think more expansively. So concerts are what we call a complement to music. What does that mean? As the price of a complement falls, it helps your core product. Demand increases for your core product. Here's what happened to the music industry over time. That dark line, that's CD sales. By the way, there's nothing you and I can do or any smart manager with that decline. That was going to happen. The question is, where else is money being made? And if you start adding up the other lines, it's being made in digital music, concerts, iPod sales, imputed iPod sales. By the way, here's what's interesting. If you add up all the revenue streams in the music industry, it's never been in better shape. It's just that the music labels are not capturing all that value now. So, second idea I just wanted to introduce, this is not about connecting users or consumers. This is about connecting products. Two products are connected, we call them complements, when the following happens. A customer values your product more when he or she has the complementary product. Okay, it's as simple as that. What are examples, just to stir the imagination? Hot dogs and ketchup or mustard. Imagine a world without ketchup and mustard. Hot dogs wouldn't nearly be as interesting. Imagine a world without roads. Cars would not be as interesting. Imagine hardware without software. That's sort of a useless world. If you're a company or a business or a government agency, you want to think about not just what product and service I provide, but what complements I provide. Here's what's interesting. General Motors, Prestolite headlights, Goodyear tires, 5 companies that used to make components of a car, got together 100 years ago, and they started building roads to connect small towns in America. They said, if we can collaborate on building roads, it helps all of us. That's what triggered an increase in driving, and that's when the federal government steps in and builds the highway system. It came from private initiative. Okay, to stir the imagination a little more, imagine a company that makes car tires telling us where the best gourmet restaurants are. Right? When Michelin executives came up with this idea, they should have been fired. There is no core competence here. Why were they doing this? Because they were telling people in Paris about those great restaurants in the south of France. Oh, you've got to get there. You've got to drive. That's complements thinking. We all know what's happening with movie theaters. In the US, theater attendance is declining. So what are theaters doing? They're offering bigger seats, better seats, more popcorn, food in the chairs, HD, 3D, so on and so forth. Those are all complements. But there's one interesting complement that's even better than all of them. Think about our movie-going attendance. We go to the movies, we get married, we still go to the movies, and then at some point, we completely stop going to the movies when we have kids. Why? Because it's hard to find babysitting. It turns out these theaters started offering babysitting services right next door. In some cases, contracting with third parties. By the way, they offered market prices for babysitting, double the price of movie going, and they were completely sold out. That's complements thinking. Okay? So, why is this interesting? We often think in business, in everything we do, in terms of competition. Everything is framed in terms of competition. And oh, by the way, competition or substitutes represent threats to our business. Well, complements represent opportunities. That's something good you can do to increase demand for your business or product or service. As digital grows, the physical experiences are becoming more important, not less important. And complements really force you to ask the question that I asked earlier, which is, what business are you really in? Okay. Are you in the CD business or the concerts business? This is sort of a simple kitchen napkin diagram of what's happening in general in the tech content spaces and pretty much all of commerce. Imagine you're a content company located in the center. That world suddenly got a whole lot tougher. And by the way, I'm using content as a synonym for product in general. Why is that? We all thought we were competing with each other in that center circle. It turns out there's a much more insidious problem. Apple makes still today 90% of its value in hardware. If I make money in hardware, I want the complements to be cheap. I want content to be super cheap. That was the iPod strategy, where they basically gave away music for almost nothing so they could make money on the hardware. So they want that center circle to be widely available and cheap. Microsoft still makes most of its money on software and cloud services. They want hardware and content to be cheap, which is why they love competition between the OEMs. Meta and Google make most of their money on advertising, so they want content, hardware, and software to be cheap. That's the Android strategy. And if I'm Amazon, I actually don't care if I give away everything else on that, as long as you come into my e-store and buy that expensive refrigerator. And that's basically the Kindle strategy. They lose money on the Kindle, they don't make much money on the content or the hardware or anything else. In other words, all these tech giants have one thing in common. They want the stuff in that center circle to be widely available and cheap. So if you ever heard this phrase, content is king, by the way, that was never true. Differentiated content was king. But even if you believe that differentiated content is king, what I would suggest is the following. The total amount of value created in the outer circle over the last 15 years, about $6 trillion. Meaning, if you think content is king, complements are King Kong. Okay, that was a bad joke, just to wake you up. Complements versus substitutes, I just want to give you one more example and then turn to education. Here's what's interesting. Every time a new technology comes along, Justin, you were referring to this, we look at it and we react with fear. We say, this is a threat to our existing business. When radio came along, literally the music labels fought it in the court system to ban it, because they said this is going to destroy music. The Supreme Court is what saved commercial radio. Once that happened, the music labels then realize, wait, free music on the radio actually incentivizes people to go and buy the song. This was the best thing that happened to the music industry. Same thing with MTV and music, VCR and movies, digital video recorders. If you remember when they first came out, TiVo, Replay 20 years ago, everyone thought this is the end of television advertising. Why? Because we could skip ads. It turns out nothing happened. Very little happened to television advertising. Why is that? The best explanation I can offer is that there was a beautiful technology for ad skipping before DVRs. It was called the neck. When an ad came on TV, I just turned my head away, or I went to the restroom or the kitchen or whatever it was. Just because there's a technology now for ad skipping doesn't mean it never occurred. By the way, here's what's interesting about this chart. Every single time, we think the new technology is going to substitute for our existing business. And in every one of these cases, it turns out to be a complement. In other words, how do we think about making sure that these are complementary as opposed to substitutive? That's the question I think we should be asking. All right. If I'm a book publisher, and I give you the same content on the iPad, I'm basically telling you as the reader, treat these as substitutes. Now the question is, how can I make them complements? So here's an example. Sorry, I had to put this up at some point in the talk. This is Tom Brady, for those of you who don't know, who was the quarterback of the New England Patriots. If you're thinking about live sports, American football in this case, they were worried that if you offer live sports through the mobile phone and streaming, this is going to stop people watching television. For 20 years, they basically were fighting this tooth and nail. Why? Because they were saying this is a substitute. So the question is, can you think about a digital product that's a complement to live TV? And once I tell you, it's going to be super obvious. Has anyone played fantasy sports? A little bit? Fantasy cricket, maybe? Yep? No? Great. Excellent. Soccer. Football. So what are fantasy sports? They basically are like digitally enabled competitions between friends. I construct my team. It's a fantasy team. The score I get for the fantasy team is based on the performance of each individual player in the actual games on Sunday. Oh, here's what's interesting. So now if I'm playing my fantasy game, I'm not just tracking one team, I'm tracking all the teams from which I'm drawing my players. I'm watching my local team, I'm watching non-local teams, I'm watching blowouts, I'm watching crappy teams, I'm watching everything. Once fantasy sports came along, live TV sports watching exploded. And by the way, the NFL had nothing to do with this. It was ESPN and Yahoo. Here's the question. So when you're creating a product that could be a complement to your physical or analog product, the simple question I want you to ask is, what's your fantasy? Okay. Here's what's interesting about all the companies on this chart. None of them are in the content creation business. They're all in the business of connecting and creating community. And so to put it all together, if you missed basically everything I've said, this is the one line to think about. Don't just think about creating when it comes to digital, think about connecting. The traditional mindset has always been about, let's create best quality product, let's have continuous innovation, agile, let's increase reach and distribution, let's look at what others are doing and copy what they're doing, and think in terms of individual initiatives. Hopefully, if you just take seriously what I've said for the last half an hour or 40 minutes, every one of those recommendations sort of flips. And that's part of what I call the content trap. Okay? All right. What does this mean? I just want to spend the next 15 minutes talking about the implications for education, and I'll just start with generative AI. What does this mean for developing a strategy for generative AI? You can be reactive, or you can be proactive. Today, I would argue 99% of us are reactive. We're just trying to understand what the heck is this technology. We're playing with it, we're figuring out things, we're adopting it, but we're basically playing defense. And we're using it to optimize existing workflows or things we do today already in our existing organization. I would suggest that one way to think about strategically is to start playing offense. Is to start not just saying what can we do that overlays on our existing activities, but how can we reimagine completely what we're offering? And for that, you might need a new organizational unit in your organizations. It'll be really hard to do with existing routines, processes, habits, and people. All right, education. So 11 years ago, online education really hits higher education. And there were a couple phases we all went through. So I'm sitting at Harvard Business School. Harvard University launches edX, the major online platform, with MIT. By the way, it was the fastest time we've collaborated within 6 months because it was all about fear. Okay? We saw faculty leaving Stanford, offering courses online, and we said, whose intellectual property is this? So the idea was very simple. Let's offer massive open online courses, meaning online courses that can reach, that can scale hundreds of thousands of people, and basically for free. That's a pretty compelling proposition if you think about it, right? Let's take quality content from the best universities, offer it for close to free, problem solved. Here's what happened. edX reached 35 million learners over the last decade. More than 150 universities contributed content. Over 3,000 courses sitting on the edX platform, roughly free. That's the good news. The not so good news is completion rates for those who started a course. 5% is being generous, by the way. It was of the order of 1 to 2%. Why is that when we're offering quality content for free? And the reason was we optimized for scale and never thought about engagement or support. The experience of watching a lecture in the physical classroom is bad enough, watching it online, it's torture. I cannot get through like 5 minutes of this. Here's the problem. And by the way, there's a fabulous book by an MIT colleague, Justin Reich, who recounts this whole decade, and the book is called Failure to Disrupt. Why didn't this disrupt what was happening in education? The MOOC era, I would argue, was a direct manifestation of the content trap. They were thinking content and scale, not about interactivity and connectedness. So we're sitting at Harvard Business School, and here was the key question. If we're going to go online, how do we do this? Well, the quickest way to go online is to simply record our discussions and stream them online. Very easy to do. We can reach large numbers. What does that allow us to get? Scale. What does it compromise? Engagement. Because the online learner is not actively participating in the discussion. The other way to do it is to say, I'm actually going to offer digitally, through Zoom-like platforms, classes where I can lead a discussion directly with the learners of like 30 to 50 people. That gets me high engagement, but what does it compromise? Scale. This is the tension that's fundamental, not just to the problem we were facing. I would argue this is the defining opportunity and the greatest challenge for democratizing education, is how do you get engagement at scale? All right, here's how we think about this traditionally. If there's engagement on one axis, scale on the other, the residential model, when done well, gets you high engagement, it doesn't scale. There's limits to the physical campus, the classroom capacity, the number of faculty we can hire, and so on and so forth. The digital model gets you scale, but it clearly seemed to compromise engagement. And we all thought there's a deep trade-off between these two. What I want to argue is this trade-off can be broken. Here's what we started thinking about 10 years ago. So we said, look, we're seeing all these lessons from companies out there who've experienced digital. Can we think in those ways to reimagine what education looks like? So we said, we're not going to copy anything about the classroom. We're going to ask the question, what makes classroom learning work well? And we boiled it down to these 3 principles. When we have case discussions, we're starting with real-world problems, not theory. Students are actively involved in the discussion. They're not passive. And they're learning from each other. Those are the 3 principles. So we said, let's take those principles and now reimagine how they would express themselves online. So here's what happened. 3 months into the project, we started building a platform offering 3 courses, good content, if I may say so. I was one of them. Great platform. And then I noticed that I had 3 students working with me, MBA students, who had been saying something to us for 3 months and we hadn't been listening to that. They kept saying, Professor Anand, we don't just learn from the faculty in the classroom. We learn from each other, in the study groups, in the gym corridors, in the lunch conversations. They were basically talking about peer-to-peer learning. By the way, we had articulated that as a principle, and yet when it came to building the platform, we were falling into the same trap that I'm writing this book about. This is how darn challenging this is. We think about scale and taking what we do and just broadcasting to everyone as opposed to reimagining the product. It was a very sobering moment for me, as you can imagine. But we pivoted the entire project and started really thinking, how can we engage at scale? Here's a few things we did. First page of the platform, you don't see any content. You just see a global map. There's pulsating bubbles, people in different towns across the world. You can click on a bubble, you see who's in that town, you can message them, start connecting with them. On the first day we launched the platform, 300 people logged in. At the end of that first day, there were 14,000 profile views. It turns out all they want to do is check each other out. The content can come later. By the way, it's very sobering and humbling for us. And I just realized with gratitude and honor that a few of my core students are in this room. So that's how we started. The second thing we said is, oh, can we do something better than the physical product? We have these things called Harvard Business School cases. They are like 10-page text-based documents. We said, oh, digitally, we could have videos. It doesn't need to be just text. Suddenly the case comes to life. We started thinking about interesting ways to explain these problems, as opposed to asking why are fixed costs relevant to managers. Start with the problem like, why were book publishers threatened by the launch of the Kindle? And through that problem, you start realizing why are fixed costs relevant to managers. We allowed for simple things where if you're trying to play with a concept, just allow students to use a slider to start playing with this exercise interactively so they get a first-hand experience. We said no videos longer than 3 minutes. We came up with the 3-minute rule. Every video has got to be 3 to 5 minutes long. Every 3 to 5 minutes, you've got to be doing something on the platform. There's nothing passive. For example, answering a poll. Once you answer the poll, you see other people's responses, and then you can start interacting with them. Here's where the biggest challenge was. We said this is going to be entirely asynchronous, but we wanted to be high engagement. And my colleague said, you're crazy. Like, we can't do that. How about 10% synchronous? And I said, the moment we have 10%, that's the 10% that the students will love, and then we'll have to increase it to 20% and 30% and so on. So we had a hard stop at 0 live interaction. The big concern is, if students have questions, who's going to answer them? So obviously, we had to rely on students answering each other's questions. But then we look at online platforms, and these discussion boards, where that happens, basically fail. 97% of the comments on those discussion boards are from 3% of the students. Why? Oh, it turns out for many reasons. It's impossible to search for the right question that's relevant to me. There are like these long threads. There's no incentives for me to help other people on the platform, and so on and so forth. So we started thinking about these things, and we said, hey, why do students speak in our physical classrooms? They speak because we tell them that part of your grade depends on whether you speak. Why don't we do the same thing online? So online, we said part of your grade depends on whether you answer other people's questions. And suddenly, 85% of the students moved to the discussion boards. The other thing that happened is, we said, we're not going to jump in at the first wrong answer. Give them time. If it persists for like 3 days, then we'll jump in. For the first 3 weeks, we had content experts on standby, ready to jump in. The number of times we had to intervene was exactly 0. There's an old saying in education, trust your students. They'll figure it out. By the way, this is not new to Harvard Business School. There's an experiment, some of you might have seen this in India, where computers were placed literally in trees, in villages. They just placed these computers, and they wanted to see what happened when kids in the village started interacting with them. So kids would go up and say, what is this thing? They'd walk away, they'd come back, they'd start hitting a few things. Oh, they'd see some things are popping up. Then they'd get together, start playing together, and within 1 hour, they were actually interacting with the computer. That's the famous hole-in-the-wall experiment. That's basically what we were realizing. This is the wisdom of crowds. By the way, the one thing that we did copy directly from the classroom was the famous Harvard Business School cold call. What happens in a physical classroom? If I'm having a discussion, I don't just wait for students to raise their hands. I actually might call any student. I say, Curtis, what do you think? And then suddenly Curtis has to pay attention. By the way, why is that terrifying for the student? Not because they're afraid of how they look in terms of the faculty. They're afraid of how they look in terms of their peers. So we had something called the online cold call. You're going through the course, suddenly at random a pop-up appears. It says, Curtis, you've been cold called. There's a time clock ticking in the corner, 2 minutes or less, 30 words or less, and your answer is visible to the entire cohort with your profile picture. Just a way of making this a little more interesting. By the way, the first time our students saw this, they were terrified. After a while, they get used to it. Here's what's interesting about the online cold call. When I call Curtis in the physical classroom, I can't call anyone else while I'm speaking to Curtis. Right? I've got to wait till Curtis finishes, and then I turn to the next person and I say, what do you think? Online, I can cold call 30% of the class at the same time because it's simultaneous multi-person interaction. Oh, you suddenly start realizing digital in certain respects may actually be better than physical. And those were the ideas we started generating. This was the geography of conversations that happened worldwide. By the way, with digital, you can also get data on exactly what students are doing. So when you ask the question, when are students spending most of their time on the online platform, what do you think the answer is? Which day of the week or time of day? Sorry? Weekends. That's the good guess. It turns out to be Wednesday evening, Thursday morning. Wait, what? Why is that? There's a simple reason for that, which is Thursday at noon was the module deadline. This is called procrastination, and we can now measure it. By the way, one of the things we did was then correlate for every student the degree of procrastination for that student with their grade in the course. There was almost a one-to-one correlation. The more they procrastinated, the worse their grade. So we show them this data, and now their behavior starts changing. Learning outcomes. By the way, this is with completely asynchronous learning online. After 12 weeks, we give them a final exam. The question is there a difference between those who already had prior knowledge of the subject versus those who didn't? We found there was a difference, and it was about 3 percentage points. That's it. So this is in 12 weeks. You won't be able to read this. I'll just read it for you. This is an email. We sort of get these emails often. This is an email I got 2 years ago. Person who said, I'm a professional opera singer. This is during COVID. She said, I was unable to perform. I didn't know what to do. I came across your online courses. I said, okay, let me take it. What ensued was simply the most remarkable educational experience of my life. And by the way, this person has 3 degrees. She's been to TED, Davos, Aspen, and she says this. But the most interesting part to me was the last paragraph. She said, another surprise came in the form of the community I gained through my core experience. Much to my surprise, despite never meeting in person, we forged strong bonds of support. And then she concludes, I would say that of all the social circles I'm privileged to be a part of, these are amongst my most reliable and closest friendships. Okay, so I'm like intrigued. So I write back to her. I say, can we chat? She said, sure. So I asked her, I'm like, what happened here? She played back to me literally. She said, every feature on the platform, this is what behavior changes was inducing amongst us. This is how you build relationships and so on. That was great. But then she said, you made one mistake. And I said, what? She said, you triggered these relationships between us, but once the course was over, you kicked us off the platform. Oh my gosh, like something as simple as that. How silly were we? So she said, you created an army, but you've still to activate it. What I did subsequently was natural, which is I hired her to help us design the social elements of the next learning platform. And she worked with me for several months. She's still working part-time. Earlier this year, she had to leave because she was appointed as the first cultural ambassador for the arts and humanities by the Biden administration. And she said everything she has done was a direct experience of this completely asynchronous learning experience that she took. All right, this is another synchronous classroom that we built, partly again to think about digital at scale. And over time, one of the things we've realized is that curve I was talking about, there are now ways to break that trade-off. In other words, we can get engagement at scale. By the way, why is this interesting? It has huge implications for Professor Robinson's question. If you were designing a university in 2023, what should that university look like? How can we think of taking advantage of what's happening in the world with digital technologies, digital platforms, digital content, some of the best content from the world, and then blend it with a local experience that's meaningful and advantageous for that localness, not for digital content or classroom content. There's a huge opportunity, I think, in front of you, honestly. And I'm excited, frankly, to um, to hear about it and learn about it. All right, so the engagement versus scale trade-off can be relaxed, but it requires digital-first design thinking, and social capital is scalable outside the residential experience. One of the things that was interesting was initially we were just offering these courses to individuals. Then we started realizing, wait, a better way to do this is through partnerships with other universities. The law school's pre-matriculation program at Harvard, when they opened up their program during COVID for free to the rest of the country, they got 75% of law schools in the country to take this course. We had a partnership 6 years ago with 5 liberal arts colleges in Michigan, where they came to us and they said, we don't offer courses like what you have. Can you give us your courses at a wholesale rate? We will provide the faculty, we will, to wrap around it, we will provide the credit, the assessments, the grading, the mentoring, the support, the projects. That's a full experience, which is much better than your pure digital experience. By the way, the students loved it, the faculty loved it, the trustees loved it. The thing I will say has changed in my mind is we used to call it the last mile delivery. And then someone told me, that's the wrong phrase. It's the first mile. They are the ones interacting with the students. That's the first part of the mile. Then we can fill in the conduit and the channel to everything that we might offer. By the way, here's what was particularly interesting. 6 years ago, Harvard's introductory computer science course ended up being live streamed at Yale. At Yale. Like incredible, because they said we don't have an introductory computer science course of this quality, and we're completely open to also licensing a course from them. And to come full circle, one of the greatest privileges I had was initiating, with the help of Principal Denzel Williams, Justin's predecessor, an agreement between the UWI Five Islands campus and Harvard Business School for access to the business programs I talked about. That is just the beginning of the partnership. I am excited to think about what lies ahead in this partnership and between all of us. And I'll just close with a few minutes of comments on COVID. COVID, all of us heard about stories like this. Remote learning is a bad joke. I taught online school this year, it was a disgrace. But here's also what interesting that was happening. When we surveyed our students, here's what they say. 91% said the online experience was as good or better than the residential. Why? I don't think it's because it's Harvard. It's only because we started this journey 10 years ago. We had time to prepare for COVID, so when COVID happens, we didn't have just 3 days to transition everyone online. We had 10 years of experience. Why is that important? I think this debate is often confounded. People say, oh my God, COVID was terrible, ergo digital education is terrible. No, digital education was terrible when you had 3 days to prepare. That was the difference between emergency teaching and online learning. Those are two very different things. Another way to say this is supposing you knew nothing about pizza. You never heard of this thing called pizza, and I told you, hey, you know what? Like, make a big round flour, put it in the oven, put some sauce over it, and then add any topping you want. And I give you 3 minutes to decide what toppings you want. And you never heard about this. The first thing you might think about is basically putting all my existing food on the pizza. Sort of something like this. That's emergency teaching. Once you give me a few days, I can suddenly make the pizza more interesting. So I just want to throw out this phrase, beyond the PDF. When we think about digital, we should go beyond the PDF. A huge number of things happened during COVID, many innovations. One in particular I just want to point out, at the Harvard Grad School of Education, a 1-year master's degree had to go completely online. By the way, we have a residency requirement, so we had to waive that. The dean of the School of Harvard Education had a brilliant idea. She said, this was in June 2020, she said, everyone we admitted before COVID. They thought they're coming to an in-person experience. Now that we're going to be completely online, should we open up another round of admissions to basically people who never even applied? And her colleague said, please don't do this, admissions takes 9 months. She said, let's give it 3 weeks. They opened up admissions for 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, they got 3 times the number of applications they do in a regular year. Here's what was more interesting. Those online applicants were more diverse, more global, and more experienced. There were ministers of education applying for the 1-year online degree. Why? Because it's hard to take 1 year out of your job. As we often say, talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. And that's what digital allows us. This culminated in the task force. By the way, every one of those examples goes back to those 3 things I was saying. Scale, spoke to hub, and spoke to spoke, manifesting through this. So the COVID effect was the biggest piece in my mind, breaking assumptions and unleashing creativity. And the question is, how can we hold on to that in what we do going forward? Okay, I'm not going to spend time on this. This is the journey of Harvard over the last decade. The only thing I want to say here is people often ask me, why did Harvard go down this path in the first place? There was no burning platform at all. The only reason we did it was because of a deep desire to learn and experiment and really thinking about what we do as a mission. Our mission is to train and educate students and leaders around the world. There's nothing that says in the mission, do this in a physical campus. Having said that, by the way, I will say the organizational change aspect of this is the single hardest thing. And I have all the scars to prove that. There's a phrase that I learned from Shipstead, forget and borrow. Borrow everything you need from the parent, but forget all the habits. Forget all the habits. We often say in business, your experience is your greatest asset. When you create new things, experience often ends up being your greatest liability because we tend to reproduce what we already know. And so I say this to all the leaders in the room, it's creating the triggers, the vision, the culture. This is where you matter. Okay. All right, platforms, I promised I would say something about this. The platform learning space is a total mess. Every university, in fact, every school within Harvard choosing a different platform. This is what we've tried to get away from. And one of the things we're doing is now building a new platform for all the schools across Harvard. But because we're building it for all the schools, also building in a way that other universities can use. Why is this interesting? About a month and a half ago, we just announced the first partnership. This is with the United Negro College Fund. They're building a digital campus for 9 HBCUs. They came to us a year ago and they said, you know, you're 6 years ahead of the curve. Can we partner in terms of thinking about what we can learn from you, but also what you can learn from us? And it turns out they're thinking in ways that we hadn't even envisioned. So this is genuine two-way bidirectional flow. This is the way they describe it. It's UNCF having its own tenancy, so to speak, on the platform, where they're building a course repository, they're building out operations, and they're building out expertise in content and pedagogical development. Notice, by the way, the word Harvard does not appear in that picture. We don't care. Whether we're in the front of the room or the back of the room, they are the ones serving their learners. That's what's important. Okay? So I think we're moving to a world in education which used to be marketplaces. I would now call it multi-tenancies. Not last mile, but first mile partnership opportunities. Not retail, where we only look at students, but where we partner with other universities. And not a world where we think there's going to be a winner-take-all, but truly a win-win-win. I'll close just trying to tie these things together. The story of the digital journey for educational organizations, universities, starts with this. The first instinct was to reproduce that classroom digitally. Keep going. I hope everything's okay. I just have 1 minute left, so. The first instinct is to reproduce the physical experience digitally. That's the PDF. If you do it in that way, the digital experience will never be good. And then the gravitational pull is back to the physical. How do we get beyond that PDF thinking to totally reimagine and recondition ourselves? That's the story. Hopefully, there's some lessons that I've shared that might be interesting. And by the way, if you get that right, the next natural question is, what's the role of the physical campus? Maybe it's to enhance those connections that we could never get purely digitally. What's happening in commerce? You have companies like Walmart starting with physical stores. When they started digitally, it was just the PDF of the physical store. That never worked. Now they're doing some really interesting things, where it's not just last mile delivery, pickup, flexibility. I don't know if any of you have heard, they've been running experiments in 3 states in the US where they put a fridge in your garage, they pay for that fridge, and because they have the data on when you bought what item, they will come and restock the milk without you ever having to order it. Okay, it's super creepy, and the customers love it. Okay. If that happens, the question is, what's the role of the physical store? And the answer is, maybe it's for fulfillment or to become a showroom. But that's how we need to think. And finally, something that's relevant for all of us, the role of the office. We started out with the physical office. When we first went to Zoom, we were just reproducing our meetings on Zoom. And that was terrible. 9 hours on Zoom a day. Then we started thinking, maybe there's certain things we can just do asynchronously. And oh, by the way, you don't need to live 1 mile from the office. This is what started happening. I think it helped Antigua, probably. But once you recondition and you have remote work from anywhere, you've got to ask the question, what's the role of the office? And that's basically where we are today. And that's a joke. That's the TV series, The Office. Maybe the role is just to socialize, right? But that's the question we've got to start thinking about. By the way, this is GitLab. They have a work from anywhere policy. They only meet once a year to take that photo. That's when they get together. The point is, I think when we start thinking about the journey, it's not just digital first thinking. We've also got to be thinking about what is the fundamental role of physical, in-person, analog getting together. And that's what we need to do really, really well. With that, let me just thank you for allowing me to be here in person. I appreciate the talk. Thank you.
Can we all stand just to allow for the Governor General to take his leave?
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Please be seated. I think we will all agree that we have just experienced a very riveting lecture. I did promise that the lecture would be enlightening, enriching, and that it would be a scholarly treat. And so I would like to, all of us, to give Professor Anand a very warm applause. I think the discourse was extremely rich, and we have been enlightened, certainly, in this academic hall. And we would like to thank Professor Anand for this excellent lecture, in my view. We're going to allow some questions for 15 minutes or so. Shavar Maloney, our marketing officer, is at the back. Please just stand, indicate, give your name, and he will bring the mic to you, and you can ask some questions to Professor Anand.
All right, good evening. All right, good evening, everyone. We do apologize that it's a lapel mic, so you'll have to hold it in your hand. So I'm going to ask persons to just hold the mic. We ask that you keep your questions as succinct as possible. And if you do have a follow-up, we'll allow 1 follow-up question per person because we want to get through as many questions as possible. So the floor is now open. Don't all rush at once. I take it that it was an excellent presentation, so it was all clear, but we have some questions. So we have Professor Robinson.
Okay, thank you for that. Excellent lecture, very stimulating. I guess as a principal, I also have a mind on the administrative end, because what I find within our system, one of our real challenges is what I call the customer service aspect of education. Do you have any thoughts on what are the implications of a sort of a digital delivery at scale in terms of the admin challenges, in terms of managing students and their experience from application to graduation?
It's a great question. Let me maybe start with a story about what happened during COVID and think through the implications of that. The one thing that was interesting about the COVID experience was when I speak to our students and I ask them, in terms of content delivery and knowledge transmission, how much did you get during that online period compared to what you might have gotten face-to-face? And they say about 90–95% actually. That was totally fine. You ask them, what did you miss? Oh, the big thing we missed was the interactions with other students on campus. That was the big thing we missed, right? Running into each other on the athletic fields, in the dorms, serendipitous interactions, and so on. What's interesting is when we think about the life of the student, as you would well know, out of a 24-hour day, they might spend 3 hours in the classroom. Might. The rest of the time, it's basically that out-of-class experience that, when you think about it, was the traditional role of the university. It was a period of, right? I often tell my daughter this, who's a sophomore in high school now. This is a period, think about this as the fill-in-the-blanks period between when you graduated from high school and when you're going to be in the workforce. By the way, just imagine that mental model. When you graduate from high school, the person you are, and when you start the workforce. Those are two different individuals. The role of the university is to bridge that gap. It's not just about filling you with content, it's about growing you as a person. It's about developing your identity, your confidence. So that's what disappeared. The piece that I think we tried, and some universities probably did it better than others, I think MIT did an excellent job on this, by the way, was let's start thinking during that digital period of providing one-on-one mentorship to every single student. Why can we do that? Because you don't have to walk to the office hours, something as trivial as that. We can literally in one click be looking out for you. And by the way, here's what's interesting. When we think about those support services and that mentoring, unlike the physical campus, we don't need to restrict it to only the administrators on campus. We can get all our alumni to also become mentors while you're going through this experience. What a thought. So that's what we started doing. We started leaning in. Effectively, some of our alums became part of the administration. Now, why do I say that? Because I think your question is spot on, which is, how do we think of ourselves? And by the way, I speak for faculty, but it's true for all of us as staff, in service of those students who are coming to us for the probably most developmental years of their life, trusting us with that. And how do we make sure we can build that person as opposed to deliver them content? It's a mindset, I think, right? It's a mindset more than anything.
Okay, we have one from Mrs. Lee, and then we'll take Mr. Adam.
How are you, sir?
Very good.
It's a pleasure to meet
Thank
you.
you.
So at this time, I'd like all the Harvard Core participants to stand with me, please. All the persons who would have undertaken Harvard Core in Antigua and Barbuda, and you're here tonight, please
Wonderful.
stand.
Thank you. That made my day.
Yes.
Thank you.
We're surrounded by great people in Antigua and Barbuda with numerous abilities and talents. And Harvard Core has done us very well at the University of the West Indies Five Islands campus and within diverse businesses and sectors. Now, you've spoken eloquently about Harvard Core. And we want to know, having undertaken so many disciplines at Harvard, why economics, why accounting for managers, and why business analytics? Because it could have been so many other areas of study. Why these three areas, Professor Anna?
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much, and I
Great.
yield
Thank
to you, sir.
Thank you. That's a great question. So just to clarify, we now have 21 courses online, right? It's a large part of the MBA curriculum. The reason we started with those three was twofold. First, if we had started with core strategy, core finance, core technology, core leadership courses, how far do you think we would have gotten in creating the online venture? Right? The fear that I talked about is fear that impacts all of us. The most important thing we did was to basically tell our colleagues the courses we're offering have nothing to do with the MBA program. It's so far away from you. No one has territorial ownership over this. We're just playing in the sandbox here. So that was the organizational reason. There was actually a more fundamental reason, which is when we were starting to think about digital, here's the question we asked ourselves. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And the problem that we were trying to solve for our MBA students on campus, we said, wait, they have a great experience when they come here for 2 years. But there's one slight problem, which is about 30% of our students come in on day one, and they don't know the basics of accounting, economics, and data. And we take that knowledge as a given. And so for the first 8 to 10 weeks, they're struggling. And they're coming from non-traditional backgrounds oftentimes, nonprofits, the military. So for 25 years, we had tried to create in-person pre-matriculation programs like boot camps for them, covering these three courses. Here's what happened. 20 years ago, the course just on economics and data was 2 weeks long, on campus, in person. The students loved it, but they said 2 weeks is too long in the summer. Can you reduce that to 1 week? We then reduced it to 1 week. Once we had 1 week, what do you think they said? Can you reduce it to 3 days? And that was the difficulty in the inflexibility, right? Students don't want to come back early. The second thing was something very sobering, which is I used to head the first year strategy course at Harvard. This is a semester 2 course, okay? So the last day of this course, this is about 11 years ago, student raises his hand. This is the last day of the first year. And he says, Professor Anand, I'm still not sure I understand the difference between willingness to pay and price. I thought I was a good teacher. And I felt in that moment, we had failed our students. And by the way, these were similar questions coming from questions about accounting, questions about data. And then you realize that the case discussion method doesn't allow you to go deep into fundamental concepts. If I'm having a case discussion and a student says, excuse me, time out, I need to understand willingness to pay and price, that ain't going to happen. And so that's basically the problem we were trying to solve. And we said, what are the most important fundamental concepts they need to understand for entering any MBA program? It was those three. By the way, the thing that surprised us was when we created this, we thought this was pre-matriculation for MBA. It turns out a year and a half into the program, 60% of those who were applying to the program were people in business already or in different professions. Contractors, real estate brokers, physicians, lawyers, administrators, deans of universities, airlines pilots writing to us saying, by the way, we need to know basic accounting or basic economics. We never learned that. And that was the piece that was most surprising. Anyway, so that was the story for how we started.
Good afternoon. Dr. Anand. Sorry. Thank you very much. I think that your presentation was very insightful. But I have a question, and I'm not sure if, I'm just curious on your take on the particular question I have here. But after kind of more or less emphasizing the importance both of networks, both for business and any other type of enterprise, I'm curious to get your thoughts about the importance of telecom liberalization in the context and how that is important for national digital transformation. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that you could share.
Can you provide more context to what's happening here?
In Antigua?
Yeah.
Well, at the moment, the best way I can describe it, we have a telecom infrastructure, a telecom environment that's governed by a 1952 Act. And it's very much not very liberal in my opinion, and I think it's kind of constraining the nation itself for other players to get into the market and really take full advantage of some of the transformation that you've been alluding to, because it's to me it's if I could really describe how it operates, I would say it's built on the premise that to do anything you need permission from the government, and so therefore there's no latitude for innovation, there's no latitude for you to get involved, and it's all kind of centered around the major players, and there's no opening, very little latitude for other players to enter the market, and therefore it means in my opinion stagnates our development and all those things that we talk about and we love to hear, and the kind of things that we think can enable us. Because the way I see that how we're strangleholding ourselves is the fact that I think if we go by the experience we've had previously with the gaming industry, I think the lesson we should have learned from that is that it wasn't so much the gaming industry, but the fact that we had infrastructure that allowed us to provide services to an external market. I think was the key lesson that we should have taken away from it. And so I think we've kind of hamstrung ourselves because we're not allowing us, other people here in Antigua, I think, to kind of get to a point where we can provide services on the outside and liberalize the market to give people full access and let the creative juices kind of, flow.
Yeah.
So,
let me just offer a couple of thoughts. Obviously, they're not going to be context specific for Antigua, since I'm just not as well versed with what's happening here on that particular front. But some general thoughts to your question. I think the analogy I would use is similar to what Professor Robinson was describing earlier with respect to the opportunities for organizations or countries that don't have the existing analog infrastructure to take advantage of the digital revolution. Very much similar to how do we create the future university in 2023? You might say, how do we create the conditions for fill in the blanks in 2023 when we don't have the physical infrastructure? That's a massive opportunity. In fact, the data shows it, right? When you think about, I grew up in India where to call landlines what they were would be, not going to complete that sentence. You think about all the innovations in gaming, they've come from Korea. All the innovations in mobile, connective apps I was talking about coming from China. A lot of the innovations in fintech, mobile, coming from India. There is no question that the very countries that lack the physical infrastructure are leapfrogging, right? And frankly, sort of like further ahead of where the US is in terms of mobile services. Right? Walmart is looking for payment systems to the organization Paytm that it bought as part of the Flipkart acquisition in India. It's not looking for other inspirations within the US. So to me, that's the easy part, right? Which is, how do we actually create those conditions? With respect to the role of government, though, what I would say is there's two additional things it might and ought to be able to do. It's not just a question of let's open up. Can they play a coordinative role? If you look at the digital identity system in India, it was initiated directly by the government, right? And it's now ubiquitous. It's the largest digital identity system in any country in the world. You could not have had that happen at the cost it did or the infrastructure without government intervention. Now, you need enlightened government to be able to do that, right? And they basically sort of got some of the brightest minds in technology to help with that. But that's one piece, which is that coordinative role. The other piece I would say, quite frankly, is guardrails. When I think about now, many of the challenges we're facing with digital technologies, the irony is I spent an hour talking about the benefits of connectedness. The challenges are coming from the costs of connectedness. When we think of security, privacy, anything, every single person thinks they're a media company today, misinformation, fragmentation. There are moments, I will confess, when I feel I wish the government was actually intervening more, not less. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the tension, right? Which is, how do you create the conditions on the one hand for creativity, but at the same time sort of create the guardrails for this not to go completely crazy? And I think it just depends on the market we're talking about. So I don't know if that makes sense as a general comment, but as I said, I may not have the direct experience here.
Hi. Good evening, Professor Anand. My name is Danique Jordan, and good day, Professor Anand. My name is Danique Jordan, and earlier in the beginning of the lecture, you spoke about the importance of spoke-to-spoke hub, and used the example of the informal channel of peer-to-peer contact. And towards the end of the lecture, you spoke about the importance of organizational structures. For those of us who want to be on the offense in creating better learning platforms or communication platforms, would having an initiative or a organizational structure to recognize informal channels and then have an initiative to develop those into the mainframe be helpful, especially in our country?
That's a great question. So let me just share with you our experience on that and then generalize. The piece that we kept trying to think about when we were creating this digital unit was not, can it disrupt our existing university, but can it enhance and complement it? Why is that interesting? If we wanted to disrupt it, we would have kept it completely separate. Go do your thing, let's fund you, right? But what we did was give it enough freedom to think about what that product format looked like, but at the same time incentivize them to think about the interests of the university. That's a delicate balance. This is the forget and borrow piece that I was talking about. Just to amplify this tension, some of you may have heard of my late colleague, Clay Christensen. Clay was the father of the phrase disruptive technology. Early on, when we were building Harvard Business School online, Clay came to me and said, "You're going to fail." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "There is no example of digital units that succeed that are still part of the parent. You've basically got to go off and be completely separate." In fact, Clay's line to me was, "We should be buying the University of Phoenix." And my reaction was, "Clay, if you want to destroy our brand, that's exactly what we should do." But that's the tension, right? He had a point, and the point was exactly right, which is you want freedom. The thing that in hindsight, I don't think this was intentional on our part, that in hindsight we ended up doing well, was we located our digital unit 300 meters away from the main campus. That's it. It was close enough, yet far enough. Most of our faculty didn't know we existed. And that was the single best thing. If we had gone to our full faculty and asked for permission on every single thing we were doing, there is basically zero chance we would have been able to launch on time. So the thing I keep saying is to build these units, what you need is get the people who have passion and then give them protection. But don't have them asking for permission. Okay? That's the tension. So, thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. So I teach in a medical school here on island at American University of Antigua, and what we had to do when COVID came along is transfer in-person teaching, online teaching. We did it in 10 days. It was very challenging. What I'd like to know, I'm sure this happened globally, what I'd like to know, has Harvard, Yale, and the universities that you work with, have you had any good experiences from that mandatory digital transformation that even though we're out of COVID, you still continue to apply? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I'm going to go back to this slide that I skipped over. Oh, specific to medical education, yeah. So there are a few things that happen. By the way, my wife is a cardiologist, so I see this every day. A few things that happen. The first is the ability to draw in experts beyond the constraints of the local campus. So when we ask faculty, what were the top 2 or 3 things that happened during COVID which you'd like to continue? By the way, in that survey, 83% of our faculty say we'd like to be able to use some digital tools even when we go back to completely in person. The first is drawing in experts from everywhere. And this literally is happening on the medical campus as well, right? It's like we're not restricted to the local experts. We can draw in experts who are 1 click away. The second I would say, and this is where in early days, but this didn't happen at Harvard, it was happening at Case Western, I believe, where they were using digital artifacts to do things like anatomy and physiology and so on. And now that's evolved into AR applications and VR applications. When you look at some of those things, you're like, this was tailor-made for medical education. Okay? You know, I used to love biology and chemistry and physics when I was in high school. You know, you ask someone the simple question, if you were in a car and you threw a ball up while the car is moving, where would it land? By the way, a lot of engineers get that answer wrong. Short of actually going out in a car and actually experiencing that, there's ways to simulate that through VR, right? Medicine, equal number of things. It's like, how do I get a 3D perspective on what's happening inside the body? Oh my gosh, that's impossible with 2 or 3D or whatever. We can now use digital simulations to do that. I would say that's one of the most exciting things, honestly, that's happening in the digital space. And the third piece is the thing I was talking about with respect to access. Both the 0L pre-matriculation program at the law school, by the way, this happened with the medical school as well. They have something called HMX, which is core anatomy, core physiology, core, 5 courses, which they created for Harvard medical students, which they're now offering to anyone anywhere in the world. That's another opportunity where we can train our students so that on day 1, they're coming in with the requisite amount of knowledge, which we don't have that heterogeneity, which actually puts many students at a disadvantage. So those are just, I think, 3 of the things that I'm seeing and hearing play out on the HMX campus. There's a bunch of other things. So in the task force, we had 2 of our colleagues from the medical school. They started creating master classes. And by the way, this was being created by the medical students for medical students, right? That's continued afterwards because it was a very efficient, much better way to actually teach certain content. But these are sort of 2 or 3 of the main things that I would describe. And I'm glad to go back to some of my colleagues and get probably more on the ground in the weeds examples as well.
Good evening, Professor Anand. Excellent presentation. The fundamental features of the development of electronic commerce within the context of digitization, is it for competitive advantage or it is for improving customer service or to improve quality of service and expanding customer service? Also, I would like to, well, I'm concerned about legislation within a digital environment.
It's a great question. So let me use a story to actually highlight the tension I think that you're trying to get at. .com bubble and burst 2000. What was the big lesson? The big lesson was there was a lot of value created for customers and almost no value captured by organizations. I think it highlights the tension you're talking about. These technologies can create value. Creating value by itself does not translate into competitive advantage. I think, frankly, that's the #1 challenge I see when my students come to me with projects about things they're super excited about. Like, oh my gosh, this product or service could do X, Y, and Z. It has all these revolutionary implications. And then you start digging into what's truly differentiated about what you can do versus what anyone else can do, and the answer is almost nothing, right? I think this is a big question that's going to confront us with generative AI. A lot of value being created. How do we create strategies? Not products and services. How do we create strategies that allow us to preserve something about what we do better than anyone else? That's a hard question. The way I would frame that question, okay, about competitive advantage is the following. Imagine a world with you, not with you individually, with you as an organization, and imagine the world without your organization. What's missing? Did the world lose anything? It's a very sobering question to ask. Because most times, it's very hard to come up with an affirmative answer. That's the core of the competitive advantage question. And let me close with one piece here that I think is fundamental. There was a famous book written by a digital expert, great book, which I admire greatly, which was talking about the fact that the reason digital is so advantageous is because bits are ubiquitous and atoms are not. I think that gets to the second part of your question. The first part, though, is when you think about competitive advantage, the advantage is that atoms are scarce and bits are not. That's what gives us competitive advantage. Competitive advantage comes from the fact that we have something scarce. The digital world fundamentally is about everyone having access to the same thing. So it runs into direct conflict. One of my favorite examples is Netflix. Netflix, when it built its DVD business, its competitive advantage was the fact that it had 40 distribution centers across the country. The fixed cost of that was something no one else could replicate at scale. Once you go to a streaming world, anyone can do streaming. You and I could set up a streaming business, and it loses 90% of its market value. And then it had to recover by original content, right? So I would just underscore, I think, the tension you're highlighting, which is one between value creation that comes from digital technologies and value capture that comes when thinking about the question of competitive advantage. It's a great question. Thank you.
Good night, Oliver Lewis. So, going back on what you just spoke of just now, three things ran across my mind that weren't related to my original question. So I'm going to start with the original question. How effective is generative AI as a teaching tool and as a teacher? Now, it just dawned on me that you guys are collecting a ton of data, so you have a very large data model to use as a teaching method. Have you guys looked into it, and what do the trial and results look like? And
Yeah.
I'm going on the assumption that yes, you have already looked at it.
Yeah, no, I would say we're in early days. Let me just give you a sense of where things are. So there's been a lot of experimentation across the different Harvard schools over the last 6 to 9 months. We have just as of a month ago set up 3 task forces across the university. One for generative AI and the implications for research, generative AI and the implications for administrative processes, and generative AI and the implications for teaching and learning. That last task force is the one I'm chairing. It comprises faculty from across the university. Let me share 2 or 3 observations with you. One, we're still very early, okay? And just to give you a sense of what I mean by that, there's a non-trivial fraction of our faculty who have never opened ChatGPT. And this is with many of the faculty leaders shouting from the rooftops, which is we better be thinking hard and detailed about this. The second is the first reaction that happened over the last 9 months, and it's still happening in many places, is what I would call the defensive reaction, which is, oh my gosh, this is going to basically kill everything we do, particularly in the form of assessments, right? The thing that's interesting to me is there's already what I would call generative AI proof assessment strategies that are starting to bubble up. Simplest example, instead of simply saying write an essay on XYZ, which generative AI can do regardless of what that XYZ is, what if you asked your students, write an essay on XYZ and refer to 5 examples from our class discussions? Oh, that's interesting. Now, what's the principle in what I just said? The principle is that I'm having you rely on some private information that most of these LLMs don't have access to. That's the principle. But I can start thinking about many things like that. The third thing I will say is one of the things that we just did a month ago was create, and we were talking about this earlier, a private sandbox environment for our faculty, students, and staff to play with. What do I mean by a private environment? We have 3 to 5 LLMs in there, access to those by negotiating with the companies. Private environment meaning we can upload data safely without fear of security, privacy, confidentiality, so that the LLMs are not training on that data or using it in any way. Because the moment confidential data gets out in the world, as we've seen with Samsung and others, it's a total nightmare. It allows us now to play with this in a private environment. And there's some really interesting use cases. We're sort of in that early phase there. It's still in the testing phase. But many interesting use cases that people are literally just coming up with. So my big prescription would be the role of the administrators and the faculty leadership is not to say this is how you should do things, but create the conditions, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, for everyone to unleash their ideas. So that's where we are. Okay, we're still in that testing phase. I think, I have some more thoughts, but if you ask me this question 3 months from now, I think we'd have some very concrete plans. The best we can do right now is just test, learn, experiment, learn, refine, and so on.
All right, so I'll take our final question of the evening, and it comes from one of our students.
Uh-oh.
Good evening. First of all, love the presentation. My name is Dominic Olukoga, just focus on the Dominic part. I'm a student here at UWI and a representative of the guild. My question is kind of the contrapositive of a previous question in that, what would you find the disadvantages of moving closer to, let's say, the digitalization era and further away from, I don't want to call it the Stone Age, but time sort of gone by? What do you find the disadvantages of that to be?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the things that I think are more or less we've been talking about for a while. I don't think a world with 100% digital interaction is something anyone, particularly me, aspires to. Why? It's an artificial world in terms of self-selection of behavior. Like, you know, we're seeing this with social media. Stuff that people post is highly selected. I'm not going to post everything that's happening in my life. I'm going to only post certain things that I think other people would look at me in a different way. That's number one. The implication of self-selection is we're all then seeing this artificial world, which we think is so much better and different than what we are as individuals. And this leads to issues about identity, confidence, mental health. As someone said, right, like earlier when we were in school or college, it was fine. Like you were competing in cross country against kids your age. And some of them were better and some of them were worse. You were competing in math against kids your age in that particular school. Now you're seeing this 18-year-old who's like winning the chess on Math Olympiad. You're seeing this 15-year-old who's breaking like world records. And suddenly your world is, wait, like, is that my comparison set? And the point is, no, that was always the case. We just never had exposure to that world. And that's not the world, right? That's not our world. Like, that's just an artificial world. So I think these two things are related, right? Which is selection, incentives, behavior, and isolation, mental health, and everything that goes with that. Those are the two biggest issues I see with, I think, what we would call this construct of a purely digital world. Having said that, and by the way, I don't give tech companies a free pass at all, okay? When I hear some of these tech giants saying, oh yes, but think of all the good we've done, I'm like, no, sorry. There's no free pass. Like, take what it is for what it is. If you're gonna claim credit for the good, take responsibility for the bad. And that's really the way we ought to be thinking about a lot of those organizations. But the thing that gives me cause for optimism is, and this is the last part of that digital journey I was talking about. If we can imagine a digital world that takes advantage of that digital medium, it has direct implications for how we interact in the physical world and what the role of that physical world should be. And now if we think about a blended world that combines the best of both, that could be an interesting outcome. But the piece there is the blended world, right? It's not like I'm only doing one or the other. I think, as you said, living in the Stone Age would be somewhat anachronistic, and living in a purely digital world would be quite depressing. So let me pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anand, and thank you to all our persons who posed questions this evening. I'll now hand back over to our Director of Proceedings, Mr. Hiram Ford.
Thank you very much, Professor Anand. Can you please give our guests a round of applause, please? As a token of our appreciation for such an inspiring, thought-provoking lecture, I'd like to invite our principal, Professor Justin Robinson, to give Professor Anand a token of our sincere appreciation for a very inspiring lecture.
English Harbor, you're always free to come back.
That's lovely. Thank you. Come down? Sure. Yeah.
It's Thursday night. Big reggae party in this area, so we can go there after.
Thank you. Put it in front. Here we go. I love this. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, man.
All right, colleagues, the task is mine to offer some brief a brief vote of thanks. So let me start by thanking Professor Anand for his lecture. I'm sure that we ranked this lecture. It's only the second one, but it's really ranked in the top draw. So thank you once again, Professor, for this very, very stimulating lecture. It was indeed enriching and certainly scholarly from my perspective. This lecture follows last year's lecture, the inaugural one, and we collaborated with a number of private sector statutory bodies in a partnership to produce this second lecture in the series. I would like to start by thanking Carib Seas, a shipping company, for graciously agreeing to be a part of the sponsorship in terms of support of the lecture. So can you give Carib Seas? The State Insurance Company Limited has always been a partner with the campus since its inception. And we'd like to also thank State Insurance Company Limited for continuing to be a partner in the production of this lecture. Adams, Antigua and Barbuda Department of Marine Services and Merchant Shipping, and I notice the CEO is present. Thank you ever so much, sir, for always coming to support activities at the Five Islands campus. The Citizen by Investment Unit, Antigua and Barbuda, and Mrs. Donovan has been following undergrad studies, being a student at the Antigua State College Department of Undergraduate Studies, which really has been morphed at the Five Islands campus to continue that rich tradition of producing excellent higher education programs. So through her leadership, Citizen by Investment Unit, we thank you once again for supporting the public lectures so far at the Five Islands campus. The Financial Services Regulatory Commission, and I notice Ms. Shepherd is here. She has a tough time saying no to the Five Islands campus. And this is their second endeavor in supporting the efforts of the campus. Liat, I'll just say Liat, the Caribbean airline, for providing those wonderful chairs, especially to facilitate our Governor General. And let me also thank the Governor General, even though he isn't here during the vote of thanks. As you know, he's one of a prominent alumnus of this University of the West Indies, being a medical doctor and undergoing his training at the Mona campus. So let me just thank the Governor General for taking time out from his very busy schedule to be with us tonight, albeit that he had to leave for another engagement. So to the Governor General, thank you very much. I don't want to forget anybody at all from this list, because that really would be criminal in terms of all the sponsors. But I want to thank the planning team for this lecture, especially Anne-Ina Joseph, my administrative assistant and assistant registrar for operations at the Five Islands campus, for her sterling effort in making sure every detail surrounding this particular lecture went according to plan, and to ensure that I signed what I had to sign and so on, so that we could move everything along. The IT team, Kwasi, Hal, and the other members of the IT team for their support all the time. The senior management team at the Five Islands campus, now led by Professor Robinson, but certainly this would have started under the tenure of Professor Denzel Williams, for always supporting these endeavors. As a university, we really have to be promoting an intellectual discourse all the time. And so I want to just say a heartfelt thank you to the senior management team for so willingly supporting the efforts of the planning team in putting on this particular lecture. The media. The media have always supported any events taking place at the Five Islands campus, and I'd like to say a heartfelt thank you to the media who is present tonight in producing this particular lecture in our public lecture series. The audience. Without the audience, this whole effort would not have been worthwhile. And you have been a great audience, and so I would like you to give yourself a big round of applause. The project management team. The project management team and facilities management, they do a lot of work in the background, but they're the ones that were instrumental in producing what you can, I'm sure you will agree, was a very decorative space, appropriately staged for this particular lecture. To the project and facilities management team, I say a heartfelt thank you. Indeed, I want to thank also the persons behind the scenes, all of our admin staff, clerical and otherwise, for their efforts in working assiduously to put on this lecture. And indeed, the entire campus, who in one way or another, the ground staff, the cleaning staff, and indeed everyone else who would have contributed to what I would regard as a very successful evening, having witnessed an excellent intellectual discourse within the university's compound. The sound men behind the scenes. They say the best is for last, because without the appropriate sound, I am sure that the lecture would not have been successful as it is. Let me just end by just thanking everyone who had an association with the production of this lecture. And we will invite you in advance to the third public lecture that will take place at the Five Islands campus, arguably in far grander facilities. Chef Beard, who is our caterer for the evening, is waiting in the background for the consumption of the food that has been prepared. So let me just thank them for their services. And finally, I want to, when you came into the lecture area, you would have had a musical rendition by Fusion, and their involvement in the proceedings. We partnered with the Calvin A. Foundation in producing our first major event within the 75-year anniversary celebrations. This is the second one, so it's indeed significant. The Five Islands campus pledged to engage in two major activities for the 75th anniversary ceremony, celebrations rather. The first being the launch of a financial care project that we hope our students will benefit from. And this is indeed the second activity, which is this major public lecture that I think we can deem to have been a resounding success. Thank you very much for coming, and you have been an excellent audience, and so we now will invite you to the reception in the back of the room. Thank you ever so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next year.